On September 18, 2012, a Harvard professor stood before a room full of scholars in Rome and held up a piece of papyrus the size of a credit card, 8 lines of faded Coptic text. Line 4 read, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" Within hours, the story was on every front page on Earth. Within weeks, scholars were calling it a fake. Within 4 years, a journalist would trace the papyrus to a hot tub installer in Florida who was running pornography websites on the side. This is not a story about whether Jesus was married. This is a story about what happens when the most prestigious university in the world encounters something it desperately wants to be real.
The most read book in history. The least understood.
Karen King was not a fringe figure. She held the Hollis Chair of Divinity at Harvard, the oldest endowed professorship in the Americas. She was the first woman to hold it. Her career spanned decades of meticulous scholarship, building a single argument: that early Christianity was far more diverse than the Orthodox canon suggests. That traditions about women's leadership, including traditions about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, had been systematically suppressed as the church consolidated its theology. Books, papers, decades of work. And then a stranger emailed her photographs of a papyrus fragment that said exactly what her career predicted should exist: the physical evidence she'd been arguing for, written on ancient papyrus, in ancient Coptic, from a private collection nobody had heard of. Here's what most people miss. The content of that fragment was not absurd. There are early Christian texts that discuss Jesus and Mary Magdalene in intimate terms. The Gospel of Philip describes her as his companion using a word that can mean partner. The Gospel of Mary positions her as a leader among the apostles. The Gospel of Thomas mentions her by name. The idea that some early Christians believed Jesus had a wife is not fiction. It's a real scholarly conversation, grounded in real ancient texts. That's what made this forgery so dangerous. The content was plausible. The trap was perfectly baited. And King didn't just present the fragment. She named it, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. But the text doesn't say gospel. It's 8 lines on a torn scrap of papyrus, 4 words in line 4 that might reference a wife. No title, no context, no attribution. The word gospel was King's invention, and that name turned a fragmentary text into a global narrative. A Harvard professor hadn't just found a papyrus, she'd found a gospel. The academic world split within days. Leo Depwitt at Brown University called it a forgery immediately, before any testing was done. The Vatican's newspaper rejected it within 48 hours. Francis Watson at Durham University published a paper within weeks, arguing the text was assembled from the Gospel of Thomas. But King had defenders. Roger Bagnall at NYU, one of the world's leading papyrologists, said the material looked genuinely ancient. The battle lines were drawn, linguistic suspicion on one side, material science on the other. And somewhere in Florida, the man who had sent the papyrus to King was watching it all unfold on the news. 2 years of tests. Then, in 2014, Harvard published the results. Carbon 14, dating at the University of Arizona. The papyrus dates to the 7th or 8th century, genuinely ancient material. Ink analysis at Columbia University. The composition is consistent with ancient carbon-based inks. Karen King held a press conference. The headlines returned. Scientific tests support authenticity of Gospel of Jesus' Wife. It looked like vindication. It wasn't. Here's what the tests actually proved. The papyrus was old. The ink was made of carbon. That's it. Ancient blank papyrus is available on the antiquities market. Fragments have been bought and sold for decades. And carbon-based ink is the simplest ink in human history. Soot, water, a binding agent. You can make it in your kitchen. An ancient blank papyrus purchased from a dealer written on with homemade carbon ink would produce exactly the same test results. The carbon 14 dated the material. It said nothing about when the words were written. The ink test confirmed the ink was carbon. Every ancient ink was carbon. You can date the paper, you cannot date the pen. While the science was creating false confidence, an independent researcher named Andrew Bernhardt was doing something much simpler. He was reading, comparing the papyrus text, word by word, to known Coptic texts. And he found something devastating. The Fragment's text wasn't just similar to the Gospel of Thomas. It appeared to be directly copied from a specific source, Mike Grondin's online interlinear translation of the Gospel of Thomas, a PDF, freely available on the internet. Not just the same words. The same line breaks, the same arrangement, including a typographical feature that existed only in Grondin's modern PDF. The forger hadn't copied an ancient text, he'd copied a website. And he'd left his fingerprint, a formatting error that existed nowhere in the ancient world, only on the internet. But the fatal blow came from an unexpected direction. Fritz hadn't just given King the wife fragment. He'd included a second piece, a fragment of the Gospel of John in Lycopolitan Coptic. Same handwriting, same source. Christian Askeland, a Coptic scholar, examined the John fragment and found something extraordinary. The text had been copied line by line from Herbert Thompson's 1924 published edition. Not just the words, the line breaks, the column width. A 1,924 books formatting reproduced on supposedly ancient papyrus. No scribe in the 7th century would replicate the line break of a book published in 1924. If the John fragment was a proven forgery written by the same hand, from the same source, then the wife fragment was dead. And yet, King didn't concede. She argued the John fragment's problems didn't necessarily contaminate the wife fragment. Her defenders pointed to the carbon dating. The debate calcified. And here was the problem. There is no court of appeals in biblical scholarship, no FDA for ancient texts, no final authority, just dueling papers and press conferences. Nobody could force a verdict. The stalemate held for 2 more years, until a journalist named Ariel Sabar asked the question nobody in academia had thought to ask. Forget the papyrus. Who is the man who gave it to Karen King? Ariel Sabar was not a biblical scholar. He was an investigative journalist. And journalists have a different toolkit. Not Carbon 1.4, not Coptic grammar, property records, business filings, internet archives, university enrollment records from Berlin. He started pulling thread. The anonymous collector had communicated through intermediaries and anonymous emails. But paper trails are harder to erase than emails. Slowly, a name emerged. Walter Fritz, a German immigrant living in Northport, Florida. Walter Fritz had studied Egyptology at the Free University of Berlin in the early 1990s. Briefly, he learned enough Coptic to read and write basic texts. Enough to understand what scholars in early Christianity were looking for. He never finished his degree. He moved to Florida. He installed hot tubs. And Sabar discovered through internet archives Fritz and his wife operated pornography websites. Some of the content involved themes of sacred sexuality. A failed Egyptology student in Florida, running porn websites with religious themes, who happened to possess a papyrus fragment about Jesus having a wife. This was not a random forgery. Fritz had read Karen King's published work. He knew her thesis. He knew what evidence she needed. And he gave it to her. Fritz had told King the papyrus came from a collection owned by a German-American named Hans Ulrich Laukamp, acquired from East Germany in the 1960s. Sabar tracked down Laukamp's associates. Laukamp was a real person, an auto parts manufacturer who lived in Florida. But he had died in 2002. His surviving business partner said the same thing. Laukamp had no interest in antiquities. He never owned papyri. They'd never heard of any collection. Fritz had used a dead man's name to fabricate provenance, because dead men don't contradict. June 15, 2016. Ariel Sabar publishes The Unbelievable Tale of Jesus' Wife in the Atlantic. 10,000 words. Fritz identified by name. His Egyptology background documented. The pornography business documented. The dead man's provenance exposed. 4 years of academic debate, carbon dating, ink analysis, Coptic grammar, scholarly conferences. And it took a journalist with a notebook and a phone to crack the case. June 16th. 1 day later, Karen King issues a statement. The fragment, she says, is more likely a forgery than not. 4 years of defense, scientific tests cited as vindication, a Smithsonian documentary partnership, press conferences on 2 continents. An entire scholarly position built around this fragment, reversed in 24 hours, not because new evidence emerged about the papyrus. The scholarly objections had been there since 2012, because a journalist identified the owner. The conviction was always thinner than the confidence suggested. This has happened before. In 1912, an amateur fossil collector presented the British Museum with a skull Piltdown Man, the so-called missing link between apes and humans. British scientists wanted the missing link found on English soil. Piltdown Man was accepted for 41 years. The tools to detect the fraud existed for decades. Nobody used them, because questioning the British Museum meant questioning your career. In 1983, a small-time forger in Stuttgart sold 60 volumes of Hitler's diaries to Stern magazine. Hugh Trevor Roper, the world's foremost historian of the Third Reich, authenticated them at a global press conference. He reversed within days. Same pattern. The forger created what the expert needed to be real, and the expert's prestige became the forgery's shield. Walter Fritz was not a brilliant forger. The text had grammatical errors. It was copied from a website, including a typo. The handwriting was called amateurish by multiple experts. The provenance was a dead man. By any standard, this was a bad forgery. It fooled Harvard for 4 years. The forger's skill was irrelevant. The institution's hunger was everything. You might think the story ends here. A forgery exposed. A system embarrassed. Lessons learned. In 2020, the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. announced that all 16 of its Dead Sea Scrolls fragments were modern forgeries, purchased for millions of dollars. Written on ancient shoe leather, faked with modern materials. This happened after the Gospel of Jesus' wife scandal. The Antiquities Authentication System has no independent verification body. No mandatory provenance checks, no penalties for failure. The same pipeline that produced this forgery is still running, unchanged. If a clumsy, error-filled forgery on a credit card-sized piece of papyrus with no provenance, copied from a website, fooled Harvard for 4 years. How many better forgeries are in museum collections right now? How many artifacts, authenticated by prestigious scholars, are sitting under glass in institutions around the world unchallenged? Nobody has done a systematic audit. Nobody has incentive to. Because the answer might be worse than the question. Walter Fritz never confessed. He was never prosecuted. He's still in Florida. Karen King has not published on the fragment since. Harvard has not displayed it. The papyrus sits in a drawer somewhere. A credit card-sized monument to what happens when prestige replaces scrutiny. The most read book in history. The least understood. If you want to uncover what's hidden in the next chapter, subscribe.
If you want to uncover what's hidden in the next chapter, subscribe.